When powerful institutions decide someone's love is too dangerous to remember, they don't just erase the person, they erase the proof that the erasure ever happened. The silence becomes so complete that even questioning it feels like trespassing on forbidden ground. But what happens when the person they tried to disappear was wearing a crown? This was a king who lost control of his own kingdom because he could not stop loving men. James VI of Scotland's reign was systematically undermined, his royal authority deliberately weakened, and his political future held hostage, not by foreign enemies or military defeat, but by court officials who discovered they could manipulate him through his documented romantic attachments to male favorites. By the time institutional forces finished containing the scandal, James had been reduced from an absolute monarch to a managed puppet whose every private moment was surveilled, whose love letters were intercepted, and whose emotional bonds became weapons used against the crown itself. The man who would become James IV of England had ascended the Scottish throne as a teenager, but preserved court records reveal that within years, his documented relationships with male courtiers had triggered what diplomatic correspondence describes as unprecedented institutional intervention. Palace archives show that by his early 20s, James's private chambers were under constant observation, his correspondence monitored, and his access to certain companions strictly controlled by a council that had discovered his emotional vulnerabilities could be exploited to serve their political agenda. Contemporary court memoranda document how Scottish nobility recognized that the king's intense attachments to his male favorites represented both a scandalous liability and an unprecedented opportunity for control. Diplomatic reports preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale reveal that foreign ambassadors were instructed to monitor and report on James's particular friendships, while domestic surveillance networks tracked his private meetings and emotional communications with specific courtiers. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel. This is how the next sealed file is unlocked. What the court records make clear is that this was not simply royal indiscretion being quietly managed. Archived letters between Scottish ministers show they had developed a systematic approach to containing the king's relationships while simultaneously using his emotional dependencies to advance their own political objectives. The preservation of certain diplomatic correspondence reveals that James's love for his male companions had become an open secret among European courts, transforming personal affection into international intelligence. The most devastating evidence comes from surviving financial records that document how the king's emotional attachments were monetized. Court treasurers kept detailed accounts showing how James's gifts to his male favorites, lands, titles, enormous financial grants, had destabilized the royal treasury and created resentment among nobility who were systematically excluded from the king's inner circle. These men had learned to leverage royal love as a form of political currency, but the institutional response went far beyond financial control. Preserved correspondence between court officials reveals they had begun intercepting and copying the king's private letters to his male companions before delivery, creating an archive of intimate communications that could be used for leverage or blackmail. The question that emerges from these carefully preserved records is not whether James VI's relationships with men were real. The documentation is unambiguous. The question is why such extensive institutional machinery was developed to monitor, control, and ultimately weaponize a king's capacity for love. Court records from Holyrood Palace reveal that by 1583, James VI's private quarters had been transformed into what archived administrative documents describe as a monitored space. Scottish nobility had implemented what surviving correspondence calls systematic observation protocols, designed specifically to track the king's interactions with male courtiers. These were not casual attempts at oversight. Preserved bureaucratic memoranda show that dedicated personnel were assigned to monitor royal chambers, document visitor schedules, and report on the duration and frequency of private meetings between the king and his male companions. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Vatican's secret archives documents how this surveillance network extended far beyond simple observation. Letters between Scottish ministers reveal they had established what they termed intelligence coordination with foreign courts, sharing detailed reports about James's emotional attachments and using this information to influence international negotiations. French diplomatic records show that ambassador reports contained specific assessments of which male favorites held emotional influence over the king at any given time. The sophistication of this monitoring system becomes clear through surviving administrative documents that outline formal protocols for tracking royal correspondence. Palace records show that by 1585, all letters entering and leaving the king's private chambers were being intercepted, copied, and catalogued before delivery. Court officials had created what archived inventories describe as duplicate correspondence files, systematic reproductions of James's private letters to his male favorites that were stored separately and used for what official memoranda term strategic leverage purposes. What makes this surveillance particularly insidious is how it was justified through official channels. Preserved council minutes reveal that this monitoring was presented as protective measures for royal security, while contemporary accounts make clear the real purpose was gathering intelligence that could be used to control the king's behavior. Documents from the Scottish Parliament archives show that detailed reports on James's relationships with male courtiers were being compiled and distributed among leading nobility as part of what they called royal management briefings. The system expanded to include physical surveillance of unprecedented scope. Court architectural records preserved in the Scottish National Archives reveal that modifications were made to palace structures specifically to enable covert observation of royal chambers. Administrative documents describe the installation of what they termed discreet viewing stations and concealed monitoring positions that allowed courtiers to observe the king's private interactions without detection. Financial records provide disturbing evidence of how thoroughly monetized this surveillance had become. Accounting documents show regular payments to what Treasury records list as information coordinators and behavioral assessors, court personnel whose documented responsibilities included tracking the king's emotional state, monitoring his gift-giving patterns to male favorites, and predicting which relationships might pose future political challenges. But perhaps most revealing is correspondence between Scottish and English nobility that shows this surveillance network was being prepared for international expansion. Archived letters discuss plans to implement similar monitoring systems when James inherited the English throne, with detailed assessments of which English courtiers could be recruited to continue the systematic observation of royal behavior. The question these preserved records raise is deeply troubling. How many other European monarchs were living under similar institutional surveillance designed specifically to weaponize their capacity for love? The man who would teach the Scottish court how dangerous royal love could become arrived at Holyrood Palace in September 1579. Esme Stuart, the sophisticated French cousin who had come to Scotland ostensibly as a diplomatic envoy, quickly became what surviving court records describe as the king's most constant companion. Within weeks, palace servants were documenting behaviors that would trigger the first systematic international intervention designed specifically to destroy a royal same-sex relationship. James VI was 16 when Esme Stuart entered his life, and preserved correspondence from the French court reveals this was no accidental encounter. Diplomatic archives in the Bibliothèque Nationale contain letters showing that Esme's arrival had been carefully orchestrated as part of French intelligence operations designed to influence Scottish policy through what they termed emotional leverage over the king. But archived Scottish court records suggest the French underestimated how genuine and how politically catastrophic the relationship would become. Contemporary accounts preserved in court memoranda document the immediate intensity of James's attachment to his older cousin. Palace records show that within a month of Esme's arrival, the king had granted him unprecedented access to royal chambers, elevated him to Earl of Lennox, and begun what Treasury documents describe as extraordinary financial allocations for his companion's comfort and status. Surviving letters between court officials reveal growing alarm at what they documented as the king's exclusive focus on Esme Stuart. But it was the preserved correspondence between James and Esme that would eventually provide the evidence needed for intervention. Letters archived in the Scottish National Archives contain language that diplomatic reports describe as unmistakably romantic, with James writing to Esme in terms that contemporary court observers documented as inappropriate between male relations. These communications, carefully preserved by nervous courtiers, would become the foundation for what archived council minutes term corrective measures. The institutional response was swift and coordinated across multiple European courts. Preserved diplomatic correspondence reveals that by early 1581, Scottish Protestant ministers had allied with English political interests to develop what official documents call extraction protocols, designed to remove Esme Stuart from Scotland. Letters between religious leaders document their strategy of framing the relationship as both sexual deviance and Catholic conspiracy, creating a dual justification for intervention. The campaign against Esme Stuart escalated into what surviving records show was essentially a royal kidnapping. In August 1582, James was seized during what court documents describe as the Ruthven Raid, a coordinated action that removed him from Edinburgh and forced him into what archived letters called protective custody until he agreed to exile Esme Stuart. Contemporary accounts document how the 16-year-old king was held for nearly a year while being pressured to renounce his relationship. The final separation was documented in heartbreaking detail. Preserved letters show that James was forced to write to Esme Stuart, ordering him to leave Scotland permanently, while court records reveal that the young king's compliance was secured through what official documents describe as threats to royal succession. Esme Stuart departed for France in December 1582, and archived correspondence shows he died there the following year. Some contemporary accounts suggest from what they term deliberate neglect of his medical condition. What the preserved records make clear is that this was not simply religious or political opposition to a foreign influence. This was the first documented prototype for institutional techniques that would be refined and deployed against subsequent royal relationships for centuries. How many other royal loves would be systematically destroyed using methods perfected against a 16-year-old king? The most damaging evidence of James VI's relationships with men exists in his own handwriting. Preserved correspondence archived in the British Library contains letters to Robert Carr and George Villiers, written in language so explicitly romantic that court officials documented systematic efforts to intercept, suppress, and in some cases, destroy these communications before they could be used as political weapons. What survived represents only a fragment of what contemporary accounts describe as extensive, intimate correspondence that threatened to destabilize royal authority across two kingdoms. The letters to Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, provide unprecedented documentation of a royal same-sex relationship. Archived correspondence from 1607-1615 shows James writing to Carr in terms that contemporary observers recorded as unsuitable between male associates. In one preserved letter, James refers to himself as Carr's husband and promises to live and die a true husband to his favorite. Another surviving communication contains James's pledge to ever love you best of all men, a language that court memoranda describe as problematically explicit. Even more revealing are the surviving letters to George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, which diplomatic reports document as dangerously affectionate correspondence that circulated among European courts as evidence of English royal instability. Preserved letters show James addressing Villiers as "my sweet child and wife," while promising to live and die a true husband unto you. Contemporary accounts record that these communications caused what they describe as diplomatic embarrassment when copies reached foreign courts. Court records reveal the institutional panic these letters generated. Administrative documents show that by 1610, palace officials had implemented what they termed correspondence monitoring protocols, specifically designed to intercept James's private letters before delivery. Treasury records document payments to court personnel whose documented responsibilities included reviewing royal communications for appropriate content and securing sensitive correspondence that might compromise royal dignity. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. But James's correspondence reveals more than just romantic attachment. It documents how these relationships functioned as alternative governance structures. Letters to both Carr and Villiers contain detailed discussions of state policy, military appointments, and financial decisions, showing how emotional intimacy had become intertwined with political power. Contemporary court observers recorded concern that the king's private affections were directly influencing matters of public consequence. The most sophisticated aspect of the institutional response was not suppression, but selective preservation. Court records reveal that certain letters were deliberately maintained in official archives, while others were systematically destroyed, creating what surviving administrative documents describe as curated correspondence files. This selective preservation suggests that some letters were being kept for potential future leverage against the king or his favorites. What makes this correspondence particularly significant is how it documents the evolution of royal surveillance techniques. Preserved letters between court officials show they were using James's intimate communications as templates for developing what they called emotional intelligence systems, methods for monitoring and predicting royal behavior based on romantic attachments that would be refined and exported to other European courts. The letters also reveal how James attempted to protect his relationships through coded language and trusted intermediaries. Contemporary accounts document his use of what they term concealed communication methods, including private symbols, alternative delivery systems, and deliberately misleading public correspondence designed to mask the true nature of his emotional attachments. But perhaps most troubling is evidence that these intimate letters were being systematically copied and distributed among hostile nobility as what archived political correspondence describes as leverage materials. How many other royal love letters were being weaponized as instruments of political control across the courts of Europe? When James VI became James the Crown of England in 1603, English nobility discovered they had inherited a monarch whose documented romantic relationships with men represented what archived parliamentary correspondence describes as an unprecedented challenge to royal management protocols. Within months, court records reveal that English officials had implemented what they termed behavioral modification systems, designed specifically to contain the new king's public displays of affection toward his male favorites. The panic was immediate and systematic. Preserved correspondence between leading English courtiers shows they considered James's documented relationships with men to be what official letters describe as a fundamental threat to monarchical dignity that required coordinated institutional intervention. Administrative documents from the early English court reveal that dedicated personnel were assigned to what they called royal behavioral assessment, with specific responsibilities for monitoring and documenting the king's interactions with male companions. Court ceremonial records provide disturbing evidence of how thoroughly these control measures penetrated royal protocol. Palace archives show that by 1604, official court ceremonies had been restructured to limit what administrative documents describe as inappropriate proximity between the king and his male favorites. Surviving protocol manuals contain detailed instructions for maintaining suitable physical distance and preventing what court officials documented as excessive displays of royal affection. And the sophistication of these control mechanisms becomes clear through preserved financial records that document systematic payments to what Treasury documents list as behavioral coordinators and proximity monitors. These court personnel were tasked with what official job descriptions describe as real-time intervention to prevent the king from engaging in public behaviors that might compromise royal authority. Contemporary accounts record that these monitors were positioned throughout royal chambers during official functions. English religious authorities escalated the institutional response by developing what archived church documents describe as moral correction protocols. Preserved correspondence between Anglican bishops shows they had coordinated a campaign to frame James's relationships as what official religious memoranda term sinful conduct requiring systematic intervention. Nearly court records reveal that formal theological assessments were commissioned to provide religious justification for controlling the king's personal behavior. But the most insidious control mechanism was what surviving administrative documents describe as strategic isolation procedures. Court records show that English officials began systematically separating James from his male favorites during important political functions, while creating what they termed alternative social arrangements designed to reduce the king's emotional dependency on specific male companions. Treasury records document the recruitment of what official correspondence calls suitable distractions, intended to redirect royal attention. The institutional panic intensified when diplomatic reports began documenting foreign court reactions to James's public behavior with his favorites. Archived correspondence from European ambassadors contains assessments that describe the English king's relationships as what they term unusual royal conduct that was being monitored for potential political exploitation. French diplomatic records show detailed reports about James's emotional attachments were being compiled for what they called future strategic application. Perhaps most revealing, is evidence that English nobility had begun developing what archived political correspondence describes as succession contingency protocols, systematic plans for managing royal authority if James's relationships with men triggered what they considered dynastic instability. Contemporary court observers documented growing concern that the institutional machinery designed to control one king's capacity for love was becoming a permanent feature of English royal governance. What would happen when these control systems encountered a monarch who refused to be managed? By 1610, James III's relationships with his male favorites had become what surviving parliamentary records describe as strategic political ammunition, used by opposing factions to systematically undermine royal authority. Contemporary accounts document how English nobility transformed the king's documented emotional attachments into what archived political correspondence calls leverage instruments deployed during critical legislative battles and succession disputes. The weaponization was sophisticated and calculated. Preserved letters between parliamentary leaders show they had developed what they termed scandal deployment protocols, designed to surface details about James's relationships with men at politically advantageous moments. Court records reveal that opposition factions maintained what administrative documents describe as intelligence archives, containing detailed documentation of the king's private behaviors that could be strategically released to damage royal credibility. Parliamentary debates from this period provide disturbing evidence of how systematically James's sexuality was exploited for political gain. Official transcripts preserved in the Westminster Archives contain speeches where opposition members made what they called indirect references to the king's unusual attachments and inappropriate relationships, using coded language that contemporary observers recorded as clearly targeting his documented love for male favorites. The scandal reached crisis proportions during the Somerset Affair of 1615. Court records show that when Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, became implicated in murder charges, parliamentary factions immediately exploited what archived correspondence describes as the romantic connection between Carr and the king. Contemporary accounts document how opposition leaders used James's emotional attachment to Somerset as evidence of what they called compromised royal judgment and dangerous personal influences. Financial investigations provided additional ammunition for political attacks. Treasury records preserved in the National Archives document how Parliament used James's extraordinary expenditures on his male favorites, grants totaling what contemporary estimates describe as unprecedented sums, to justify what official legislative records term fiscal responsibility challenges to royal authority. Opposition leaders argued that the king's emotional dependencies had created what they called financial instabilities, threatening the realm. The attacks escalated when George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, emerged as James's most prominent favorite. Archived parliamentary records show systematic campaigns to document and publicize what they called excessive royal favoritism toward Villiers, including detailed inventories of lands, titles, and financial grants that parliamentary investigators claimed demonstrated dangerous emotional manipulation of the monarch. Contemporary accounts record that these investigations were designed specifically to embarrass the king. Public scandal became inevitable when details of James's relationships began appearing in what surviving contemporary documents describe as deliberately circulated materials. Court observers recorded the distribution of pamphlets and written accounts containing what they called intimate details about the king's emotional attachments. Materials that political analysis shows were strategically timed to coincide with important parliamentary votes. Perhaps most revealing is evidence that opposition factions had begun coordinating with foreign courts to amplify scandal materials internationally. Diplomatic archives contain correspondence showing that damaging information about James's relationships was being shared with European ambassadors as what they called diplomatic intelligence, designed to weaken English international standing. The transformation was complete. Royal love had become a systematic political weapon that any faction could deploy against monarchical authority. But what happened when the king's own son inherited both the throne and the sophisticated machinery developed to destroy his father's capacity for authentic relationships? The marriage that was supposed to solve James VI's romantic problem became instead what surviving court documents describe as an elaborate institutional deception, designed to provide political cover while preserving the king's actual emotional relationships with men. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that James's 1589 marriage to Anne of Denmark was orchestrated specifically as what official letters call protective camouflage that would enable him to continue his documented same-sex attachments without triggering further international intervention. The arrangement was cynical from its inception. Preserved letters between Scottish and Danish negotiators show the marriage was structured as what they termed a strategic alliance, with explicit understanding that it would not interfere with the king's established emotional preferences. Contemporary court records reveal that both kingdoms viewed the union as what archived diplomatic memoranda describe as necessary political theater, rather than a genuine romantic partnership. Court observers documented the artificiality of the royal relationship from the beginning. Palace records show that James and Anne maintained what contemporary accounts describe as entirely separate emotional lives, with the king continuing his intense relationships with male favorites, while the queen developed what court memoranda call alternative social arrangements. Surviving administrative documents reveal that formal protocols were established to coordinate their public appearances while preserving their private independence. Financial records provide disturbing evidence of how thoroughly monetized this deception had become. Treasury documents show systematic payments for what official accounts describe as marital presentation services. Court personnel whose documented responsibilities included choreographing public displays of royal affection, coordinating joint ceremonial appearances, and managing what they called appropriate spousal behaviors during official functions. The most revealing documentation comes from preserved correspondence between James and his male favorites during the marriage period. Letters archived in the British Library show that his emotional language toward men like Robert Carr and George Villiers remained unchanged, and in some cases intensified, after his marriage. Contemporary court observers recorded that the king's true affections clearly remained directed toward his male companions rather than his wife. Anne of Denmark's own correspondence, preserved in Danish royal archives, provides insight into how she navigated this arrangement. Letters to her Danish relatives contain what diplomatic analysis describes as coded references to the king's relationships with men, suggesting she understood and accepted the political nature of their union. Court records show she developed her own intimate friendships while maintaining the public facade of royal marriage. But the institutional machinery required to sustain this deception was enormous. Administrative documents reveal dedicated personnel assigned to what they called marriage maintenance protocols, including surveillance of both royal spouses to ensure their private behaviors would not compromise the public illusion. Contemporary accounts document systematic coordination between English and Scottish courts to maintain what they termed appropriate royal family presentation. Perhaps most troubling is evidence that this marriage template was being exported to other European courts as a solution for managing royal sexuality. Diplomatic archives contain correspondence discussing how James's arrangement could be replicated to address similar romantic challenges affecting other monarchs whose emotional attachments threatened dynastic stability. The marriage had become a sophisticated institutional tool for containing rather than eliminating royal same-sex relationships. But what happened when the artificial constraints of this arrangement finally collapsed under the weight of authentic human emotion? The systematic destruction of evidence began immediately after James I's death in 1625. Archived administrative records reveal that within weeks of the king's passing, court officials had initiated what they termed historical revision protocols, designed to eliminate documentation of his relationships with male favorites from official royal records. Contemporary accounts document the removal of what they describe as inappropriate correspondence and unsuitable archival materials from palace libraries and state archives. The sophistication of this erasure operation becomes clear through surviving bureaucratic memoranda that outline specific procedures for locating and destroying compromising documents. Administrative records show that dedicated teams were assigned to what they called archival purification projects, i.e. with documented responsibilities, including the identification of problematic royal correspondence, the removal of inappropriate ceremonial records, and the systematic destruction of what they termed unsuitable historical materials. Financial documents provide disturbing evidence of how thoroughly monetized this historical revision had become. Treasury records show payments to what official accounts describe as historical coordinators and archival revision specialists, court personnel whose documented job responsibilities included rewriting official court chronicles, removing specific passages from preserved letters, and creating what they called appropriate historical narratives that eliminated references to the king's same-sex relationships. But the erasure went beyond simple document destruction. Preserved correspondence between court historians reveals systematic efforts to commission what they termed corrected biographical accounts that would replace existing historical records with sanitized versions emphasizing James's marriage while eliminating any mention of his documented emotional attachments to men. Contemporary accounts show these revised histories were distributed to replace authentic court chronicles in royal libraries across both kingdoms. The institutional machinery expanded to include what surviving administrative documents describe as preventive censorship protocols. Court records reveal that officials had begun intercepting and destroying contemporary accounts written by courtiers who had witnessed James's relationships with his male favorites, ensuring that what they called problematic testimonies would never reach future historians. Perhaps most insidious was the development of what archived correspondence describes as alternative narrative construction. Court officials began systematically creating false documentary evidence designed to support fabricated accounts of the king's relationships with women while simultaneously destroying authentic evidence of his emotional attachments to men. Administrative records document the production of what they called appropriate correspondence, designed to mislead future historical investigation. The erasure extended to physical evidence as well. Palace architectural records show systematic removal of what they termed inappropriate artistic representations, including portraits, sculptures, and decorative elements that depicted the king with his male favorites in ways that might suggest romantic attachment. Contemporary accounts document the destruction of ceremonial objects and personal effects that carried emotional significance related to his same-sex relationships. International coordination amplified the erasure effectiveness. Diplomatic archives contain correspondence showing that English officials had coordinated with Scottish and European courts to ensure that foreign records of James's relationships were similarly suppressed or destroyed, creating what they called comprehensive historical revision across multiple kingdoms. The operation was so successful that centuries of historians would accept the sanitized official accounts as authentic historical record. But what happens when modern archival investigation begins uncovering the evidence that survived this systematic destruction? Despite the systematic erasure campaign, scattered evidence survived in archives that the institutional destruction teams either overlooked or could not access. Modern forensic archival investigation has uncovered what preserved documents describe as accidental preservation networks, foreign diplomatic archives, private family collections, and administrative fragments that escaped the coordinated destruction because they existed outside direct court control. The most significant breakthrough came through Vatican secret archives, which preserved correspondence that English court officials apparently assumed had been destroyed. Papal diplomatic records contain detailed reports from Catholic observers documenting James I's relationships with his male favorites in explicit terms that directly contradict the sanitized official histories. These Vatican archives contain what papal correspondence describes as unambiguous evidence of the king's same-sex emotional attachments that survived because Catholic intelligence networks operated independently of Protestant court control. French diplomatic archives in the Bibliothèque Nationale preserved even more damaging documentation. Ambassador reports contain detailed behavioral assessments of James's relationships with Robert Carr and George Villiers, including specific observations about what they describe as intimate royal conduct and unusual emotional dependencies. These French records survived the English erasure campaign because they were classified as foreign intelligence rather than domestic court documentation. Particularly revealing are private family archives that preserved correspondence between minor courtiers who witnessed James's relationships firsthand. Letters discovered in Scottish estate collections contain contemporary accounts describing the king's behavior with his male favorites in terms that surviving family memoranda record as shocking to observe and inappropriate between male associates. These private archives escaped institutional attention because they were considered insignificant family papers rather than official court records. Administrative fragments from financial institutions provide additional evidence that contradicts official histories. Banking records preserved in City of London archives document the extraordinary expenditures James made on behalf of his male favorites. Financial transactions that surviving account ledgers show were systematically omitted from official treasury histories. These banking archives reveal patterns of royal spending that contemporary financial analysis describes as emotionally motivated rather than politically justified. Modern archival analysis has also uncovered evidence of the erasure operation itself. Preserved administrative documents from palace libraries contain what archival investigators describe as deletion inventories, systematic lists of materials that were targeted for removal, providing contemporary documentation of the institutional destruction campaign. These deletion records survived because they were filed as routine administrative paperwork rather than sensitive historical materials. Perhaps most significantly, comparative analysis across multiple European archives has revealed coordinated gaps in the historical record that provide what archival forensics describe as negative evidence of systematic suppression. The absence of certain types of documentation during specific time periods, when compared with normal archival patterns, creates what investigators term erasure signatures that reveal the scope and coordination of the destruction campaign. Linguistic analysis of surviving letters has uncovered additional evidence of tampering. Preserved correspondence shows what textual investigators describe as editorial intervention signatures, systematic alterations to original documents where romantic language was replaced with neutral terms, and intimate expressions were edited to suggest formal rather than personal relationships. International law archives have preserved treaty negotiations that reference James's emotional attachments as diplomatic considerations, providing what legal historians describe as unintended documentary preservation of relationships that were systematically erased from domestic records. The scattered evidence creates a forensic puzzle that, when assembled across multiple archives, reveals the authentic emotional life that institutional forces spent centuries trying to erase. But how many other royal relationships were destroyed so successfully that no evidence survived to reconstruct the systematic persecution? The institutional machinery developed to monitor, control, and ultimately erase James VI's same-sex relationships became the blueprint for managing royal sexuality across European monarchies for the next 3 centuries. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that the surveillance protocols, behavioral modification systems, and historical erasure techniques refined during James's reign were systematically exported to courts throughout Europe as what official letters describe as proven royal management methodologies. French court records preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale document the direct implementation of what they called Scottish protocols for monitoring the emotional attachments of subsequent French royals. Administrative documents show that the surveillance networks, correspondence interception systems, and strategic isolation procedures developed for James VI were replicated with remarkable precision to control other European monarchs whose same-sex relationships threatened dynastic stability. German court archives contain evidence of even more sophisticated applications of these control mechanisms. Preserved correspondence between German and English nobility reveals systematic sharing of what they termed behavioral management intelligence, including detailed assessments of which techniques proved most effective for containing royal emotional dependencies and preventing what they called succession destabilization. The marriage deception template became particularly widespread across European courts. Diplomatic archives document how the arrangement developed for James VI and Anne of Denmark was replicated throughout European royalty as the standard solution for providing political cover, while preserving institutional control over monarchs whose authentic emotional relationships posed dynastic threats. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that these control systems became institutionalized as permanent features of European royal governance. Court administrative documents show that surveillance networks, behavioral monitoring protocols, and systematic erasure operations evolved from crisis responses designed for specific monarchs into routine institutional infrastructure that operated continuously across generations of European royalty. The historical erasure techniques proved equally exportable. Vatican archives contain correspondence documenting systematic coordination between European courts to ensure that evidence of royal same-sex relationships was suppressed across multiple kingdoms, creating what diplomatic records describe as comprehensive historical revision networks designed to eliminate authentic royal emotional life from official historical records. Modern forensic investigation has revealed that the patterns of surveillance, control, and erasure documented in James VI's case can be traced through centuries of European royal history. Administrative fragments from multiple courts show similar bureaucratic structures, identical monitoring protocols, and coordinated destruction campaigns targeting royal relationships that challenged institutional authority. The template was so successful that historians spent centuries accepting sanitized official histories as authentic royal biography, while the sophisticated machinery of institutional persecution remained hidden in scattered archival fragments that survived only through bureaucratic oversight or foreign intelligence preservation. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. What emerges from this forensic investigation is evidence of systematic institutional violence deployed against European royalty, whose capacity for authentic love threatened dynastic control. The techniques developed to destroy James VI's relationships were refined and replicated across courts throughout Europe, creating what surviving documents reveal as an interconnected network of surveillance, manipulation, and historical erasure that operated for centuries. The question that demands investigation is not whether other European royals suffered similar institutional persecution. The archival evidence confirms systematic patterns of identical control mechanisms deployed across multiple courts. The question is, how many authentic royal lives were destroyed by machinery designed to eliminate human emotional authenticity in service of dynastic political control? James VI was not an isolated case. He was the prototype for institutional techniques that would systematically destroy royal humanity across European courts for generations.